Hello, I'm Lerato Madlala, and this is the 10th edition of Creatives Under Lockdown, where we focus on issues affecting artists. She, along with two other women, respond to the prevalence of gender-based violence in South Africa in a theatre production, #WeAreDyingHere. She was the first African poet to perform at the spoken word event Rhetoric in the United States. She also went against Cape Town's best poets to become the first Cape Town Ultimate Slam champion. This week, I'm in conversation with poet, writer, producer, and director Siphokazi Jonas. So you are involved in the production #WeAreDyingHere, which is currently streaming online. Tell me a little bit about the production and how it came about.
The production #WeAreDyingHere was an idea that came to me in 2019 after the death of Uyinene and a number of women who then trended under different hashtags. I think for a lot of us, especially as women in South Africa, felt this deep sense of fear and hopelessness that we were not being heard, that nothing concrete is being done about gender-based violence in South Africa. But above all, it was this overwhelming sense of despair in many of us, left with this question now of, am I next? And there was even that hashtag that started trending. So as a writer, I wondered how I could possibly speak into that particular void. At first, I didn't feel as if the arts could really have anything to say, because the reality of our situation seemed so grim, so overwhelmingly grim. But after a conversation with a friend, she helped me understand that it's not just about changing the behavior of a perpetrator, for example, that when we have these artistic interventions, we have an opportunity to articulate or to help ourselves articulate our own stories and to express what we're really feeling. And that for me was a beautiful point of departure, because I thought, let us just start from expressing what we feel about what is going on. So when it was time to put the idea together, I actually drew inspiration from a poem which I'd written in 2018 called Thanks for the Hashtag But. And the poem suggests that, yes, we appreciate these are wonderful efforts in terms of online participation, online interventions, but the reality is when in a bad situation, it's really hard to think about anything else. There's not really an opportunity, in inverted commas, to type out or tweet out a hashtag and to trend. And most stories often don't trend. So the last line of that poem says, the trend is #WeAreDyingHere.
You also wrote, produced, and performed Around the Fire in 2016. Tell me a little bit about the production, and was it not overwhelming to put together?
The first iteration of the production was in 2015, where I worked with a 7-piece band of musicians to actually put the show together. And the way in which it started was actually a series of poems that I was going to perform, and then I invited some friends of mine whom I'd seen in different places. We just never collaborated and just thought, hey, let's put this amazing thing together. They wrote the songs from scratch, put the music to it. We had a music director at the time, Ndebele, and it was just an amazing creative space that came together with just these individual poems. But suddenly they started taking on a certain shape where the characters themselves had their own lives as the production went along. And eventually it actually turned into a full production, which was really strange, like a full play, which was never really the intention. I had these individual poems that were kind of like monologues, really, with these 4 different characters. And organically, this production became a play and was part of the Artscape Spiritual Festival in 2016. I let it rest in 2017 and then kept working on it again. In 2018, we were part of the Women's Festival. So it also went through a couple of revisions. Unfortunately, as a writer, sometimes you find that you're never satisfied with the product. This was and continues to be an overwhelming project. Thankfully, I had someone else who directed, a friend of mine, Northern Africa. He was the director. By the time we got to 2018, I had changed the type of music that we were working with. We went from using keyboards, guitars, bass, drums, to using indigenous African and primarily Southern African instruments like mbira, uhadi, nyunga nyunga, and so we ended up with a 4-person band, which included the dancer Utabisa Madinga. Babalo Magwetu was on this, vocalist Ngabako Ngega, and Jason Skippers. And so that was thankfully a more manageable size but truly one of the most overwhelming and exhausting projects because I was also playing 4 characters. The hard thing was to actually shift from one space to another. I'm so grateful that I had such a patient director, because I would have maybe just walked in and was thinking about posters and giving the go ahead and getting the marketing done, and then I had to get on the rehearsal floor and try and get into character and work through that, and then at lunch I have to go back to having conversations with box office, thinking about how to sell tickets. I would not recommend it. I would not recommend wearing that many hats for one production. Sometimes it's unavoidable, and unfortunately as independent producers, what tends to happen is that we write our work and we end up having to perform and produce the work because of the nature of things and funding or lack thereof. The production was really well received, and I've recently started putting out some material because it was filmed as well, and that there's been some requests for it to come back. It is hard to promise that it will come back as a live performance, but I'm looking at the possibility of streaming that as well, because it was an interesting narrative. I had interviewed 3 women in Cape Town who told me their stories, and it speaks to homelessness in Cape Town. It speaks to, class issues, and kind of there's this one character who has to move from the flats to UCT, and then she's assaulted in that space, and kind of negotiating a number of different things, and what it means to have just women having relationships and building a sense of community coming from very different backgrounds. And so the 4 of them come and sit around this fire on a winter's night and share their stories.
So how did you feel when you were invited to perform at the poetry event Rhetoric, and how was the experience? You are also the first Cape Town Ultimate Slam. Tell me a little bit about that as well.
So Rhetoric was not by invitation, but by audition. I had sent in an audition video and it was accepted. It was a dream come true in a number of ways, because at the beginning we didn't even really know that you could audition from another country. And when I found that out, I was on top of it. And I'd been encouraged by 2 friends of mine to actually audition. That was certainly what felt like a once-in-a-lifetime experience. First of all, going to perform at Rhetoric, the platform itself, when I'd spent so many years watching their material and being a fan of so many of the poets. I remember how excited we were when they came to South Africa for the first time. So being able to go there, you obviously have to take care of all of your expenses, and I was so blessed because I had crowdfunding in order to be able to make it on that trip. And experiencing California, I already had some friends that side and built more friendships. It really is unforgettable, because there's something about having 3,500 people in this massive church who love poetry and are here to support it and are here to support the poets. It's very different to having 30 people or even 300 people. And so then also coming from a different continent, and certain ideas people have about poetry in South Africa and on the continent as a whole, and being able to showcase some of what we do. Yes, to the second question of Cape Town Ultimate Slam was a slam competition that used to run here in Cape Town. And basically we had some of the most experienced poets, spoken word poets in Cape Town, there were about 7 of us who were in competition, and we ran through this slam competition. And I won. Yes, I was the ultimate slam champion in that year.
In 2018, you made your debut in directing. How did you find the experience, and also how are you able to wear so many hats?
Yes, in 2018, I did move to I was trying to take on a different skill set through directing a production called The Widow. I think as a theatre maker, you do have a taste of all of those little elements. And sometimes, when a script comes to you, it just depends on what you might be interested in at the time. And I think having done my own work for a while, I'm quite interested in that aspect of storytelling through directing. It is daunting. I won't even lie. It is absolutely daunting. And yet it is so satisfying to be able to be behind the scenes and to see your actors just take the work and run with it and interpret it and articulate, just throw it back on stage in that way and see how the audiences respond to the work that you've put together. So directing is something that I'd still like to continue growing in and seeing where I can possibly take it. As I said, as a theatre maker, you do get a taste of the different parts of theatre making. As an independent artist in South Africa, you have to wear many different hats because you aren't always going to have work and you aren't always going to have opportunities in maybe your preferred art form. So it is important to try and build your skills in as many spaces as possible. And I just love being challenged. And so I keep taking on those challenges.
2019 saw the first ever SA National Poetry Tour and you were the headline. How was the tour?
Yes, 2019 was actually an exciting year. Because of this tour, we were able to go on the Fresh Poetry Tour, the first ever national poetry tour by South Africans in South Africa. And it was run by a company called Fresh Impressions Africa. Primarily, we went to a lot of churches, some other spaces as well. For example, in PE, we had the theatre there. And so what was interesting about this tour is that we collaborated with local artists. We made sure, that they were on the lineup. They were often opening acts or part of the lineup. And we were really quite interested in going to small spaces or small towns like Standerton, where poetry doesn't really go, because when poets come into South Africa, it's generally to the big cities. And we did have those performances in the big cities, but we also went to Queenstown, which is where I come from. And we went to Nelspruit, so the places that you wouldn't necessarily see headlining poetry. And we were quite excited to see where this particular tour will go and how we'll build audience. It was incredible to see how receptive people were to the work that we had to bring, especially those who had not been exposed to it before. And so, first Christian National Tour, it's really been amazing, and we're excited to see what the future holds.
You have an impressive body of work. You have worked on different productions and wearing different hats. But so far, what has been your highlight?
Thank you so much. I don't know if I'd consider my body of work to be impressive. I feel like I still just have so much to do, so much to put out. Oh my goodness, so many highlights. Certainly Rhetoric is up there in terms of the highlights. I think a lot of the South African festivals, which I've been to, like Poetry Africa, Abantu Book Festival, Word and Sound Festival, one of my absolute favorites, Open Book Festival, which happens here in Cape Town. I love doing the festival circuit. I really enjoy the audiences and the readers whom we get. And certainly putting on my own work. Right now, I'd say #WeAreDyingHere is really at the top of my list. That's without a doubt.
Now let's get up close and personal. When did your love for poetry art start?
I think there's a difference between when my love of poetry started and when I started writing. Because when I was in primary school, in fact, before that, I loved reading. I spent hours in a library. Back at home, at school, I just read all of the books that they had. And so my love of reading itself has just always been there. I just had this appetite for books, sometimes to the detriment of other things. But I do remember doing aesthetics where we would perform published poetry. Obviously at the time it was mostly white writers, old writers, British writers, but I was really, really good at aesthetics. I did really well. So I think that's when the love of it started. The writing came with a consciousness around the fact that I could write my own story, that it was possible for me as a young black child in Queenstown to actually write my own poetry, and that it wasn't set aside simply for old dead white men, as I always say. And art in itself, one of my first memories is of being a hippo in Noah's Ark in grade 4. So I was 9 at the time. That was my first stage performance. Although I think there were others a little earlier. I just remember when I had graduated from primary school and I was going to grade 1, and I just had a meltdown because of stage fright. And yet, it was so dramatic. All eyes, unfortunately, had to be on me at that moment. But I think the love of art has been with me because my parents were in a choir. My mom used to be a choir conductor. My dad was in the choir. I'm from a very musical family. Unfortunately, I didn't pick up a lot of that musicality. It's very average. But I think I was surrounded by it in that way.
Tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, your family, and some of the experiences that molded you into the person you are.
So I grew up in the larger Queenstown area. First in a very, very small dorpie called Sterkstrom, and then later in Queenstown. Yet I was born in King Williamstown, which is where my mom was working in that area. And she was born in Mnyameni, in a village, and grew up at Qobo, and then worked in a village close by. But my dad was from Itagastad, which is another small dorp. So these are some names you may have never heard of before. But this is all in the Eastern Cape. So that's how I was brought up. It was quite an interesting upbringing, simply because I was in that transition between apartheid and a democratic South Africa. And then my father was a policeman, so we grew up, I always say it's this kind of in-betweenness, because we had to stay at the police barracks. When I was in grade 1 and grade 2, I went to a Xhosa school, Usenati, and then when they allowed black kids into former Model C schools, I went to the Afrikaans school. So I've attended a Xhosa school, an Afrikaans school, and an English school. So I kind of covered that range of languages and cultures in my upbringing. I have 2 parents, mom and dad, and 2 sisters. So that's, a family of 5, currently kind of scattered around the country right now. I think if I were to jump straight into the things that molded me, it would probably be exactly, what I just mentioned around the in-betweenness. Growing up in the cusp of something and the end of something else, but that were in constant tension with themselves or with each other, that pull of apartheid not wanting to let go, and yet the inevitability of a democratic society on the other hand dawning. So I've always been someone who kind of moves in between spaces. And I think that's molded how I think about identity a lot, what it meant to go to an English school when I was 9. So a lot of it was preceded by learning. I had to learn Afrikaans. Before I got to the school, I had to learn English. So there's always a sense of adaptation in moving from one space to another and trying to assimilate, trying to find a place and how to fit. Those years for me probably are almost everything of who I am and how I understand my place in the world, and just thinking about all the sacrifices that my parents made for it to be possible for us to go to school. I remember when my sister and I were in school, we had to travel between Sterkstrom and Queenstown. And at some point I was at res, but then when I was in high school we had to commute back and forth, and it was about like 65k journey. And there's actually in one poem, Mampela's Harvest, where I speak about sitting on the back of Umkosi's red botsotso baki. He had this small baki, big guy, and we sat at the back. And this thing was drafty, and so we'd often have to have a blanket. We'd have to actually carry a blanket in order to stay warm, because there was a draft where the bottom part meets the canopy of this bakkie. And it was a little bit precarious. Traveled with sometimes my dad's colleague, and then eventually they said no. Especially when my third sister was born, the family is going to move to Queenstown so we can actually be closer to school. They would do the commute. That kind of sacrifice has been really important for me in thinking about how significant family is in my life and how it underpins my identity as well. So family being really important is something that I've learned from my parents. Also my faith, it comes into play in my work because of how I see people. I think a lot about grace. I think a lot about love. And, God as creator, kind of the way in which we as creatives as well are able to imagine and write things into being. And that's why I always try and, imagine the best for us, especially as Black people. I'm always in that work of imagination and bringing counter narratives to the negative stereotypes and negative discourse around Blackness and Black communities. So all of those things feed into who I am, but also my work.
What is the role of art in society?
This question is one whose answer shifts. What is the role of art in society? Right now, I think the role of art in society, for me as a Black female writer, is to write about Black women. I don't know if I can completely be confident in saying what's the role of art for everyone, but I think it's meant to have a kind of emancipatory element. As I said in the previous question, it is actually about counter narratives. It's how we want to view ourselves. It's how we are, but also how we want to view ourselves. Because you know the whole thing about art being a mirror to society, but I think art is also a blank board. We can write, we can scribe, we can create. So right now, for me, art is about counter narrative to negative stereotypes. The way in which Black people are portrayed, even in our media in South Africa. We need work that's constantly doing that. Something like #We are dying here, while not overtly a counter narrative, is something that does something different to the media, for example. So when stories are reported or a hashtag is circulated online, there's a way in which it focuses on certain limited elements and doesn't always dig into the gaps in between. You know, where the parts of the story that are lost. And so art goes for that nuanced storytelling. It goes in between the cracks, in between the hashtags, because in #We're Dying Here, we speak about the stories that don't trend. We speak about the everyday. We talk about the fear of walking past a group of men. We speak about how it feels to be harassed. How a single word can change your entire demeanor, can change your entire day, the fear that it evokes. That's not newsworthy. That's not a breaking news headline. That is where art comes in. It augments, it shines the light on those things that tend to be in the dark. Some of the things we already speak about, but we don't realize how much we speak about them within our little communities. And so art does that for us.
What more can people expect from you?
What people can expect from me and my future goals is for me to wear more hats. I believe as a writer, I'm not limited to my art form, which I think a lot of people know me as a poet, but I'm a theatre maker, and now I'm working on screenwriting with 2 other writers. We're busy working on a screenplay, which is an animated feature for young teenage girls that's set in the Eastern Cape. And so that's exciting. I'm hoping also to do some television writing as well. So you may see my name on some credits in the next year or so, depending on how things go with Corona. Speaking of which, once it's safe, really and truly safe, we'd love to take #We're Dying Here on tour. And we're excited to see how that's possible. We've already had interest from some organizations to have in-depth conversations around what the issues that the production raises. So definitely going on tour. I think a couple more projects in terms of stage as well, possibly some recordings as well. Some things I can't reveal just yet, but more hats and strengthening the hats that I'm already wearing. And hopefully sooner rather than later, my first poetry collection, which I'm looking forward to writing. And hopefully people will look forward to reading it as well.
For the next edition of Creatives Under Lockdown, you can visit sabcnews.com or at SABC News on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. For SABC Digital News, I'm Lerato Matala.